The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Populist movements march under banners of many types to make things great again, for freedom, for justice. But economist Paul Somerville says the demand for economic fairness underlies it all. Tonight, we'll hear from him on his new book, Reclaiming Populism, and debate his proposition for getting such discontent into the democratic mainstream. Then, Ron Deibert of the University of Toronto Citizen Lab explains why the most powerful cyber weapon in the world could be a cell phone. It's Wednesday, February 23rd, and that's next on the agenda. The so-called Freedom Convoy has certainly put political populism on our radar screens in Canada as never before. But a new book suggests these kinds of populist spasms aren't necessarily the result of a villainous electorate, but rather the condescending, non-empathetic response from mainstream politics and society. Paul Somerville is co-author of Reclaiming Populism: How Economic Fairness Can Win Back Disenchanted Voters, and he joins us now from Victoria, British Columbia, with some ideas about what we can do about all of this. Paul, it's good to see you again. It's been too long since you were last on this program, so great to have you back.
Thanks for having me back, Steve. It's great to be here.
Now, let's also stipulate that you wrote this book well before all of the current drama in Ottawa and other places happened. So let's point out that when you wrote this book, populist anger had really overflowed, I guess, with Donald Trump's election in the United States. But you made the point in the book that somehow Canada, Australia, and New Zealand had mostly managed to avoid those similar kinds of populist spasms. We can't say that anymore now, can we?
Oh, I think we can. I think, in fact, what we demonstrated in the book was that what happened in the United States with Trump, what happened with Brexit, other places, France, Italy, Eastern Europe, that the populist eruptions there were the consequence of long brewing discontent that we make the claim has to do very much with economic unfairness, that countries where people can't get ahead, and this is certainly the case in the United States where the American dream is broken, very much the case in the UK where getting ahead really depends on where you live, in France and Italy where inefficient markets make it difficult for people, even if they are well-educated and have the will to be successful, find it hard to get ahead. Then in all of those cases, what economists call social mobility is low, and that this has been building up for a very long period of time. Whereas countries where you have high social mobility, where you can get ahead, Canada is one of those countries, fortunately, you're very unlikely to have any sustained populist eruption. And by that, we mean really a fundamental change in what the country looks like. Post-Trump, post-Brexit, these countries are very different than what they were 5 years ago. Something fundamentally has changed. And our argument would be, if we were writing a book about what's going on right now in Canada, we would say that we've seen similar types of political discontent in the Nordic countries, for example, where social mobility is very high, where you can get ahead. During the 2015 migrant crisis, there was huge fears in Stockholm and in Copenhagen and other Nordic countries that the populist wave had come to those countries. And in fact, after a brief moment of real political discontent, by the time we got to 2020, 21, all the elections results demonstrate that populist parties in those countries poll at anywhere from 50 to 70% below other European countries. So our argument would be what's going on in Canada is a very natural expression of political discontent after a 2-year pandemic. There's a very specific group of people who are anti-vax, who are anti-mandate, have certain grudges against government. But our argument would be that once the blockades are dismantled, that this will fade as a memory in Canada, We're not going to see some political realignment that's going to create the kind of political disruption, institutional disruption that we've seen in the United States and in the UK.
Okay,
now,
let me jump in here. Right, I know where you're going next, but I want to pick up on a couple of quotes you put in the book because you juxtapose them, and they're both pretty famous quotes. So I'll repeat them here and then come out of it with a question. Here's the first quote: "Washington flourished, but the people did not share in its wealth. Politicians prospered, but the jobs left and factories closed. The forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no longer." That, of course, Donald Trump when he was campaigning for president in 2016. Juxtapose that with, you could put half of Trump's supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables, right? They're racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it, they are irredeemable. That was the Democratic challenger, Hillary Clinton. What are you trying to say by juxtaposing those two quotes in your book in the way that you did?
Well, what we're trying to say is that the populist complaint in places like the United States, in places like the UK, is very legitimate. That these complaints need to be understood and they need to be defined very precisely. And our argument is that the populist complaint is deeply rooted in economic unfairness, that these are countries where the last 30 or 40 years, it's been very difficult to get ahead. Either you don't have the tools, in places like the United States, for example, where we would argue that the American middle class lives over a trap door that can be sprung by an accident, ill health, or unemployment. Or in countries like France, for example, where markets are very inefficient. The Economist magazine had a great data point that barbers in Paris have to do 200 haircuts a month just to pay the taxes that they owe. So in these countries, economic unfairness deeply rooted in a very long period of time that affects a lot of people. And so these are complaints we need to understand. We need to articulate. We can't talk about, we've got to be very careful if you're a mainstream political party, if you want to win back these voters, be very careful the kind of language you use to describe who they are. And Trump and other populist leaders are very good about framing the conversation around populism, where they amplify the economic discontent by talking about outgroups, talking about immigration, talking about unfair trade policy. They amplify that and then make the case that the political opposition has no political legitimacy, that they're the only ones who can deliver the goods for people who are disenfranchised. So it was very important to make it very clear. You've got to be very careful to take these populist complaints seriously and not just pass them off.
Well, if language is important, let me hone in on a couple of different expressions you use and find out what the difference is between them. You've mentioned economic unfairness. It's in the title of your book. Economic inequality, you also refer to that. What's the difference?
Well, we're very clear in our book to differentiate between equal opportunity and equal outcomes. We make the case that countries where the state provides equal opportunity through a number of things, not just the obvious ones like education and health, but legal protections, taxation, to fund giving people the tools they need to be successful, that this is a very different thing. And it's a very important thing, and it's something we support, from equalizing outcomes. That equalizing outcomes is very dangerous. It's proved to create authoritarian, often criminal states, and that people need to be able to be rewarded for their contribution through what we call fair, unequal outcomes. That unequal outcomes in a social democracy are very, very important for social mobility. They're critical to create high social mobility and successful social democracies.
Well, in fact, I think, Paul, you go further than that in the book. You say that people are essentially perfectly fine with unequal economic outcomes as long as they feel they got, some skin in the game and they got a shot at the big dream. Fair to say?
Well, yes, this was, I think, one of the most important conclusions that we came to in the early stages. So Eric and I started writing the book in January 2019, and we did a research review, we did a literature review. And as we worked through the literature, it became very clear that the idea of fairness, the idea of economic fairness, was becoming very important in the conversation and needed to be applied to thinking about populism. And one of the most important conclusions we came from that by looking at some of the literature that talks about how children think about fairness, how voters think about fairness, is that people prize fair, unequal outcomes. They prize fairness. They're very opposed to imposed equalized outcomes. A very good example is how unsuccessful Jeremy Corbyn was in the 2019 election, where he thought that by offering a program of equalizing outcomes, very aggressive redistribution, that he would attract a lot of support. And in fact, that didn't happen. And anywhere that's been tried, partly as a response to the populist push, the left wing of the Democratic Party, for example, in the United States, it's been an utter failure. Human beings are deeply, deeply supportive. It's in our DNA for fair outcomes.
I thank you for setting the table for the discussion to come, which happens right now. We're going to bring two more voices into our conversation now. So, joining us on Manhattan Island in New York City, Miles Korek, professor of economics at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and in our nation's capital, probably not that far from all the stuff that's been going on for the last few weeks, there's Armin Yalnizyan, economist and Atkinson Fellow on the future of workers. And we welcome Miles and Armin back to our program. I want to start by pulling a quote here from Paul's book. Here we go. "It cannot be overstated," he writes, "how important it is for liberal politicians to get off the bandwagon of equal outcomes and identity politics and talk about fairness instead." So, Miles, let's pick up on that. Where do you stand on Paul's claim that if populism is to be disarmed, fairness, not equality of outcome, ought to be at the heart of our politics and policy? What say you?
Well, I think it's a very smartly written book. And overall, I think the distinction between inequality that's fair and inequality that's not fair is something important he's brought to the public policy literature. But I think we have to hold a number of thoughts in our mind. It's not just fairness and as an aspect of inequality that matters. It's also the nature of economic growth and social mobility. It's all three of those things that come together. What I find helpful is to sort of think of an escalator. All of us are sort of sitting on the first stairs of the escalator, probably on different stairs. And what do we expect to happen? We expect over the coming years, the coming decades, the next generation to move up that escalator. There has to be economic growth that goes with that. But a sense of prosperity is brought about by the fact that the distance we stand between each other is not too great, and there's shuffling around in our rankings. So, and that's what Paul means by social mobility. If I started on the bottom stair at the bottom, I may end up at the bottom once economic growth has happened. So, what's happened in Canada? That escalator for about the bottom 40% of the population has turned out to be a treadmill. Economic growth hasn't delivered to them the kind of progress, the kind of hope that they imagine for themselves and their children. What's happened in Canada is our distance between us has increased, so that the consequences of falling down a stair or two are much greater. This leads to polarized growth, not shared prosperity. And this is what makes people look over their shoulder and wonder and worry. So we need growth that's a benefit to all, relative equality of outcomes, and ability to move around those stairs when it really doesn't matter so much because the distances aren't that great. And over the last generation, we haven't seen that. So I just bring that kind of nuance to Paul's discussion, that it's growth, it's income rankings, and it's income inequality that all matter.
Okay, we're going to get Armin to weigh in on this issue of equality of outcome versus fairness, unfairness of economic opportunity, and then we'll give Paul a chance to respond to both of you. Go ahead, Armin.
Wow, what a rich discussion, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of it. I'm going to actually focus on the title of the book, Reclaiming Populism. And the notion that populism isn't primarily driven by economic fairness, which is the claim, or even the left behind. The idea that more separates us from top to bottom or left to right or identity like black or white, I don't think is the right frame. I think within every one of these groups, we've got a spectrum of interests. I think the abiding animus behind populism right now is the idea of the insider-outsider status. Who's making decisions about me for me? The fact that there are people in the Freedom Convoy that have appropriated the language of my body, my choice, which was what brought me into feminism in the 60s and 70s, it's just like passing weird to have that kind of identity politics taken over by white men that are angry that anybody's telling them what to do. So, and I also view populism as a complete and utter dead end. If you go back to the response to the Arab Spring, everywhere populism has taken place, it's been a way of channeling grievance, but it's about taking apart the status quo. It's not about building something new. And it's not surprising because everywhere it's about mistrust of the systems that exist being able to deliver for you. That, as I think Paul said, those people are not speaking for me. Those people are not me. So to Miles' point, absolutely shared growth, inclusive growth is the formula out of here. But how do you do it when more and more people are self-identifying in tribes that are about us against them? And when politicians themselves are wrapping themselves up in the idea that I'm the only one that can save you from this nonsense, but they're not actually offering solutions that bring everybody along. I think we're in a very troubled moment. And I would add one final thought, which is the populism we are seeing today and have been seeing for weeks with the so-called Freedom Convoy is also astroturf populism. It's being financed by people who want smaller government or no government. And so it is a continuation of a very libertarian philosophy that more markets and less government are the way to go, but it is literally being financed rather than an upswelling from people. And I think we need to be very careful about the misinformation that's out there that is fanning the flames of this so-called populism.
When you say astroturf, you mean fake grassroots, not the real deal.
Correct.
Gotcha. Okay, Paul, lots of good feedback there to your book. Where do you want to start?
Well, I think I'd like to start by making the very important point that fairness is a moving target. Just because, in our view, Canada, the Nordics, Australia, New Zealand do much better from a social mobility perspective, are kind of inoculated, to use a phrase, against populist eruptions that fundamentally change the country. The fact is that fairness is a moving target because of the way that new technologies impact the structure of the economy and create big winners and big losers. And the whole point of the political system is that the political system then begins to create policies to mitigate the differences between the winners and the losers. If it does that, then I think you'll have evolution, you'll have a positive change, you'll have high social mobility. But if the political system doesn't do that, and we argue that in the United States and the UK specifically, those political systems did not react to the powerful technological changes from globalization, China trade, and the technology shocks of the last 15 years, that you end up with a hereditary ruling class that begins to believe that they have a right to their status and to their power and begin to rewrite the rules of politics for their own benefit. And we see this really very much in the United States. So fairness is a moving target, and it's very important that we understand how technology changes the structure of the economy. The second thing is that, and I'm glad Armin picked up with the title of our book, I'm a big fan of a book written about Japan called Embracing Defeat. And we wanted a kind of a powerful verb in the title. And the original title of our book was Defeating Populism when we first started thinking about it. But it became very clear as we maybe perhaps started to empathize and sympathize with the populist complaint around economic unfairness. Again, that Americans live over a trapdoor that can be sprung by a number of different things that we kind of take for granted that you're going to be taken care of in Canada. We changed the title with the advice of our editor in the UK with Polity Books, of reclaiming populism. And remember that the underlying thesis of the book is how to win back disenchanted voters, how to give mainstream politicians the language and the tools to bring back people who feel marginalized, who feel that there's a clique, as Armin says, that basically write the rules for them that they have no part and they don't benefit from. So what we're arguing, particularly in chapters 4 and 5, is there's a number of very powerful tools that mainstream politicians can use if they take the claims of populist voters, disenchanted voters seriously, that you can reclaim the populist vote and bring it back to create a more inclusive, pluralist, pro-democratic country.
Understood. Miles, in some respects, I hate to bring the convoy back into this thing because there are so many different agendas going on in different locations that it's hard to know. But let's just say, I mean, surely Irene is correct. Part of this is, don't tell me what to do with my body. I'll on the whole vaccine issue. But part of it surely is there are a number of people who feel as if the economy has moved right along and right past them, and that the social mobility that they once thought was part of the Canadian dream is no longer there. That's certainly some people's agenda in the convoy. We've heard it. We've heard it from a number of people who've lost their jobs and who think that the Canadian dream is not part of their particular reality anymore. And I guess the question is, if they're right, what went wrong?
If they're right, what went wrong? To some degree, they are right. Statistics Canada, for example, has shown that somewhere around 50% of children are doing better than their parents. If they're right, what went wrong? Two things. One, as Paul alluded to, it's the nature of growth. What happened is, as we grabbed onto this globalism agenda, this neoliberal agenda in the 80s and 90s, opening up the economy, an economy that was hit with major changes in the way we work, with the power of computing. What went wrong is some people had to compete head on with the computer. If you do routine jobs, like think of your stereotypical factory worker who would have a piece of machinery move across him and he would weld a joint. Well, robots do that now. Think of middle managers whose major job was to process information, to move it from the shop floor to upper management. Well, Excel spreadsheets can do that now. So people who were doing routine jobs went head to head in competition with the computer, and they lost out. They lost out in status, and that impacted their identity as well. One of the things that I would pair with this book is a recent book by Michael Sandel called The Tyranny of Merit.
Oh, we had him on this program talking about that book. It's a great one.
That's right. And so what he also points out, as Paul has just said, the thing about inequality, it engenders entitlement amongst those at the top. It fosters shame amongst those at the bottom, and it creates insecurity for everybody in the middle. So this gets wrapped up with identity as well. And this is where I sort of disagree with Paul. If you just sort of move into a prescription of more social mobility, it depends upon how identity politics gets layered onto that. You talked about that famous quote of Hillary Clinton's. What went wrong is we didn't value the work that people now do in any way. We didn't recognize their dignity. What could be worse for a lot of males who did work that was more routine, whose identity was wrapped up with being a provider, than to have a highly educated urban woman tell them that they're deplorable? And so then that opens up a whole different identity politics. Two things went wrong. We didn't pay enough attention to people who can't get an education. We kept telling them, get more education. And if they can't, then they're perceived as losers. So it was the economy mixing up with a type of rhetoric that engendered entitlement, created shame, fostered insecurity.
Gotcha. That's a very nice summation of where we're at. Armin, I wonder if you could pick up the baton at this point and say, if social mobility has been and is a problem in this country right now. Maybe not as big a problem as in other countries, but it's not good enough for a lot of people still. Could you give us a few policy prescriptions that you think might improve social mobility in the country?
Yeah, but can I just refer to one comment about the role of technology driving some of this sentiment of being left behind?
Fire away.
Is that okay? Because in the wake of every wave of technological change, we have seen more jobs, not fewer jobs. In the wake of every wave of technological change, what technology does is unbundle tasks from jobs. It doesn't always displace the job entirely. And frankly, part of what Trump rode in on, the horse he rode in on, is he was going to bring the jobs back from China. That wasn't technology. That was just a cheaper you on the other side of the world. And container technology that brought it cheaply to you as a consumer, it tore you apart as a human being by pitting you as a consumer who wants the cheapest thing possible against you as a worker who wants the best wages possible. So if we're going to talk about inclusive growth as part of the solution, I think you need to be looking at the actual truckers who are vaccinated and who are experiencing wage theft. 90% of them are vaccinated, or between 85 and 90% of them are vaccinated. And the biggest issue the truckers have in Canada right now is that many of them are temporary foreign workers who are experiencing wage theft. Why are there so many temporary foreign workers? Because Canadian workers are thinking that there's going to be driverless trucks. Technology is going to take over those jobs, and there's no future in those jobs. They're actually quite good paying when the wages aren't stolen. And what we need to be doing is talking about how we make every job a good job in an era of population aging. You know, populism in an era of population aging could be leading to making more jobs better jobs, could be leading to making the best benefits are portable benefits. As we learned with our healthcare system, you compare the American auto industry to the Canadian, and we've got a huge edge, not just because our workers are better educated and can do the job just as well as the Americans, but because the employers don't have to pay for healthcare. So we've got a real issue on understanding how the social infrastructure we offer one another becomes the platform on which we build a more inclusive economy where more people are benefiting from growth because they're getting something back from it. They're not just contributing to higher productivity and more profits. They're actually seeing quality of life improving, whether it's through wages or through services that they can access, high quality service they can access at low cost. For example, early learning and childcare, which is a huge breakthrough, but the first one in a generation, 2 generations, 50 years, the first time we are talking systemically about how we give everybody more opportunity and a higher standard of living by doing it together for one another through the public purse. And I think that's a conversation that is just going to rub a lot of people the wrong way after 40 years of being told more market, less government is the solution. I think we are in an era where we're going to have to rely more on governments. And I think a lot of people are very nervous about that proposition and see it as a form of socialism when it's a form of actually taking care of one another more effectively so we can get about the business of growing the economy, if that's what turns your crank.
Paul, your comments on that?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, when Michael Sandell's book came out, Eric and I wrote a letter to the New York Times where we argued that, in fact, what we thought Sandell was talking about, because he was mostly focused on the United States, was not that meritocracy was a bad thing, that he was talking about how America was failing at meritocracy, not a failure of meritocracy. We actually think meritocracy is absolutely needs to be at the center of any successful country that wants to have high social mobility. And off of our means comments, absolutely. A fair economy is rooted in intelligent public policy. Again, we called it the twin virtues of equal opportunity and fair, unequal outcomes. And right now, we need more of the equal opportunity. We need it partly because of the way the economy has shifted. Our book wasn't specifically about Canada, but I would say that in the last year or so, the adoption of universal childcare in Canada is an absolutely fundamental part of that public policy prescription. Steve, you'll know that I decided in 2006 to run for the NDP I was recruited by Jack Layton. And the reason was I was furious with Paul Martin in 2000 and 2001 when it was clear that Canada was going to have huge surpluses. They decided to cut corporate taxes. In fact, you asked Jack Layton in the leaders' debate about the decision not to cut corporate taxes, and he quoted my name, which scared me to no end. The point is that I felt very strongly at the time, and unfortunately, it's 20 years too late, but better late than never, that Canada's doing some of the right things around this. But again, to Miles' point, there is evidence that many countries that have high levels of social mobility, we speak about it in chapter 4 of our book, as far as Norway is concerned, how new technologies are constraining social mobility in a number of countries that have enjoyed high levels. So again, fairness is a moving target. Social mobility is something that's difficult to achieve, but it's a combination of equal opportunity and fair, unequal outcomes.
You actually have a more interesting political background than you let on there, because not only did you run for the NDP, you're a former Bay Street big bank economist, and you also ran for National Policy Chair of the Liberal Party of Canada.
Yeah.
You've taken an interesting political journey along the way. How has all of that, you're dabbling in a variety of political partisan outfits and jobs as well, how's that helped inform what you've got in the pages of this book?
Well, I've been thinking about this book for 30 years. I know we talked about it 5 or 6 years ago. My parents didn't graduate from high school. I was born in the UK, raised in Toronto. I got a good education, never had to worry about healthcare. I ended up being in Japan, doing my PhD there. And then when I graduated, I went into investment banking, global finance. And around the age of 35 or 36, I became very wealthy. And when I reflected on how that was possible, I mean, sure, I worked hard and there was a lot of discipline and sacrifice. But the fact is, without all of the advantages that I had for being Canadian, that would have never occurred to me. That would have never happened. And coming back to Canada in 1995 and working on Bay Street, I met a lot of people who had the same background as me, but they were a lot less convinced that it had to do with Canada. It had more to do with the market and with their good luck. And so I felt very strongly that I wanted to bring that conversation, that personal experience to public life. And that's why when I was approached by Jack Layton, I decided to, man bite dog, run for the NDP and try to make the case that hope and prosperity were the two things that could define how we could think about Canada. And I think that's expressed itself in the book, equal opportunity and fair, unequal outcomes. Well, we hope this discussion, which Miles and Armin, we thank you for contributing to, has whetted our viewers and listeners' appetite for more. For more, you can read Reclaiming Populism, How Economic Fairness Can Win Back Disenchanted Voters by Eric Protzer and our guest, Paul Somerville. My thanks to the three of you for joining us on TVO tonight. Be well, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Anyone with a cell phone probably knows about the potential to be tracked as it pings off cell towers while they go about their business. But there is a deeper, more insidious kind of tracking, too, that technology increasingly makes possible and can be difficult to stay one step ahead of. That's particularly true for people, journalists, for example, that powerful interests want to keep tabs on. Ron Deibert is a professor of political science at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. He's also director of the Citizen Lab, which is at the forefront of studying this kind of surveillance. And he joins us now from the provincial capital. And Ron, it's always good to have you on our program. How are you doing these days?
I'm doing very well, thanks, Steve. Glad to be here again with you.
Glad to hear it. At the end of last year, your Citizen Lab became an almost daily reference point on newscasts, if you can believe it, in Poland. How come?
Mm-hmm. Well, in a nutshell, we discovered that five in total, originally it was 3, members of Poland's opposition parties and movements had their devices hacked with a spyware called Pegasus, which is sold by an Israeli-based mercenary surveillance firm called NSO Group. Citizen Labs research has unearthed many country cases, many cases around the world of abuse of this particular very powerful surveillance technology that's sold by companies like NSO Group to government clients. In this case, it appears that, as I said, members of the opposition, senior lawyers, prosecutor, other people in Poland's opposition had their phones hacked and data surreptitiously, gathered from their devices. This is now a scandal in Poland. They're calling it Poland's Watergate. So, yeah, very much our research was at the center of this because we forensically examined the devices of these 5 individuals and showed that their devices were hacked multiple times each, numerous times each, in some cases leading up to parliamentary elections in 2019. As part of their activities in Poland.
And typically in these cases, if you're trying to hack into somebody's phone, in this case, the Polish opposition party, what kind of information are they looking for?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, the way I would answer that is by describing the capabilities that this type of spyware provides to a government client operator. So when you hack into a device using Pegasus, which is probably the most sophisticated mercenary spyware technology in the world today, first of all, it leaves no trace. This particular version of Pegasus involved no interaction on the part of the target. They simply commandeered the device silently, so the target wouldn't be aware that there's somebody else, a spy in their pocket, if you will. Once you're inside that device, you can do virtually anything and more, really, than a user can do. So that means you can read every email, every text message, even those that are end-to-end encrypted. You can turn on the camera. You can turn on the audio capture, effectively turning that device into a bug. You could also plant falsely incriminating information if you so desire. I'm not saying that happened in this case, but the prospect is certainly there. So there's a whole range of things that can be done. Speaking to the question you asked, one of the victims, a prominent senator who was leading the opposition in the 2019 elections and whose phone we determined was hacked multiple times with Pegasus, his confidential information was actually broadcast out of context over Polish state media to try to paint a picture of him that was unflattering and perhaps corrupt. So that speaks to what you're asking here. What are the possibilities? Well, you can certainly spy on someone, engage in espionage, but you can also gather information, taint it in various ways, leak it, broadcast it out of context to falsely incriminate somebody.
Well, you are painting a picture of something that I have seen described as the most powerful cyber weapon in the world. Do you agree with that characterization?
Yes, absolutely. That was an analysis done by Google's Project Zero team. This is like their high-tech threat intelligence team. They did a breakdown of Pegasus based on actually a disclosure that the Citizen Lab made. We captured Pegasus in the wild last year and disclosed it to Apple. Google Project Zero did a breakdown of it, and they said this is by far the most sophisticated piece of surveillance technology that they had ever seen.
Now, Pegasus is that sort of mythical horse with wings. Why do they call this thing Pegasus?
I don't know. That's some branding exercise by the company itself. I have no idea. All I can say is this is very powerful technology sold by a very lucrative company, makes a lot of money, a lot of revenue from this type of sale to government clients who have a insatiable appetite. I mean, you can imagine, just think about how I described this type of technology. If you put yourself in the position of a government security agency, how addictive that would be once you start, spying on someone, gathering information. You want to do more of it. And this surveillance technology is sold on a license basis. So how many victims do you want to hack? Well, it'll cost you X dollars.
Now, your Citizen Lab has initiated something called the Pegasus Project. What's that all about?
The Pegasus Project is a consortium of journalists and NGOs, especially Amnesty International, that came together to work on investigating abuses of Pegasus spyware. Actually, the Citizen Lab's role in that particular project is more of a supportive one. We did a peer review of some of their methodology and the forensic analysis that they did. So we're not behind it, if you will. Although I will say that the Citizen Lab actually did the very first public evidence-based report on NSO Group back in 2016. We really kicked off investigations into NSO Group and have done extensive reporting ever since. Pegasus Project actually was given by a whistleblower a list of 50,000 phone numbers, which appears to be a list that is for reconnaissance of potential targets. Some of the people on that list actually had their phones hacked. Amnesty International has a tech lab similar to Citizen Lab using similar methodologies. They did forensic analysis and determined that some people on that list had their phones hacked. The big takeaway here is that you have this very powerful technology, and NSO Group is but one company in a very large marketplace of other companies providing similar technologies that is largely unregulated and prone to widespread abuse. And that's because most of the government clients lack oversight of their security agencies. Maybe they're authoritarian or autocrats. And we've seen extensive abuse of this type of technology targeting journalists, human rights defenders, lawyers, and others.
Well, here's where it gets tricky because, of course, the Israeli manufacturer says, don't blame us. And NSO says, well, all our stuff is government authorized, so don't look at us. We're not the bad guy here. So as we try to understand who the bad guy is here, who's on your list?
Well, multiple parties are on the list, I would say. First of all, that type of rationale from NSO Group simply doesn't fly today. We wouldn't accept that type of reasoning from any other industrial sector, frankly. It just doesn't hold water in the 21st century. The UN has something called the Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, which makes it clear that companies are responsible for the products and services that they sell that may be then misused. And right now we're seeing many individuals who have been targeted with Pegasus put that test to the claim because they're actually litigating. They're suing NSO Group for the harms that they've experienced. But I will say, to just repeat what I said before, NSO Group is just one company coming from one jurisdiction in a global industry. It's a big marketplace that's growing in leaps and bounds. It's not the only company. So part of the responsibility lies with governments. So all governments have a stake in this marketplace. Many of them contract out with companies like NSO Group, including Canada and the United States. When we engage in cyber espionage abroad, we don't necessarily do it all in-house. We have to contract out to private companies. And the reality has been that governments have stayed away, they shied away from opening up regulation of this highly sensitive area, which is very much in the center of espionage activities, which are traditionally in the shadows. And so we're seeing, a whole set of harmful consequences as a result of this lack of government regulation, principled governance over this very potentially harmful industry and marketplace.
Now, in its defense, the NSO Group did say last fall that it had canceled agreements with 5 countries/governments because they had, quote unquote, betrayed trust. And I wonder what inference you draw from that.
Well, I don't take much of what they say seriously because, frankly, their responses to Citizen Lab's reports and other groups' reports have been to largely, obfuscate, cast aspersions on researchers, not really meaningfully address what is in front of us. So, for example, we discovered and verified that many close confidants of the murdered Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi had their phones hacked with Pegasus. There is no doubt about it, including both his wife and his fiance and a Canadian permanent resident, you may recall, Omar Abdulaziz, who is a close friend of Jamal's prior to his gruesome execution. When asked about this, NSO Group swears up and down that their technology was not used to hack Jamal Khashoggi's phone. Well, we don't know what happened to Jamal Khashoggi's device, but we do know everyone around him was hacked, and they don't address that directly. There are many, many other examples of that. One other one I'll give you, we discovered that New York Times journalist Ben Hubbard, who covers Saudi Arabia, wrote a book on Mohammed bin Salman, had his phone targeted with Pegasus back in 2018. NSO Group swore up and down that Citizen Lab was mistaken. This is impossible, blah, blah, blah. And then while that was going on, we later on did an extensive forensic analysis of Hubbard's phone using new methods that we have, and verified that his phone was hacked not once, but multiple times, including right in the midst of when NSO Group claimed that this was impossible. So this is a company that's obfuscating because they're not really held to account for it in anything other than the type of public interest research that the Citizen Lab is doing right now and the court cases that are underway.
But can we conclude that because they canceled those 5 contracts with those 5 governments / countries, that they do understand, the NSO Group does understand that, that they have a problem here?
I think they perceive the problem as a public relations problem, not a problem of harm having to do with their products. That's the problem here. They try to dance around any evidence that's brought into the public domain about the fact that their technology was implicated in these gruesome, horrible cases of human rights abuse. The other thing is, we know for a fact that they are selling to serial abusers of their technology. Mexico is a case in point. There are numerous reports of the Citizen Lab, front page of World News, New York Times, that expose these harms. And then they would go back and sell again, and we would discover new harms. Same with Saudi Arabia. So I don't, like I said before, I really don't think it's even useful to ask the company questions at this point in time. They lack all credibility. By the way, there is an equity fund that owns NSO Group. We should be asking that equity fund these questions as well. But the reality now, we're not going to solve this problem by trying to persuade this company to do good. Even if they started doing good, there'd be other companies that would step into their shoes to do harm. So we've got a clear market failure problem here. I see this as the biggest crisis for global civil society right now, the unbridled use of this incredibly invasive technology. Once you get inside somebody's device, you're effectively inside their heads, you're inside their social networks, you're inside their family. And that requires robust oversight mechanisms that are frankly entirely absent right now, although there are some positive developments, I would say.
Well, let me ask you, Ron, one of these sort of on the one hand, on the other hand questions. You know, you have clearly pointed out, on the one hand, it's probably not a great thing to have journalists or political activists or people who are doing human rights work. I don't think we want them spied on. On the other hand, you know, governments also use this technology in order to keep an eye on terrorism or narco trafficking or get inside criminal organizations. Can we categorically say then that there is no positive use for this technology?
I can't categorically say that there's no positive use for it. I have, many colleagues, there are many people in the human rights space that believe and advocate that there should be an outright ban on this type of technology. The reality is that we live in a very dangerous world. We need law enforcement to do their jobs. We expect intelligence agencies to gather information about pressing security threats, and they are going to use these technologies to investigate crimes. So I don't think it's realistic to say that we should just do away with them. We have to begin with the assumption that they're going to be out there. So what we need to do is make sure that they're not abused, that law enforcement and intelligence agencies stay within their lanes. That's easier to do in a place like Canada or the United States or Europe or the UK than it is a place like Saudi Arabia or Mexico or Rwanda, Nigeria, all of the other clients of NSO Group. So what do you do there? Well, we have to ensure that in addition to having robust domestic oversight over our police agencies' use of surveillance technologies, we need to ensure that there are strong export controls, that governments, in this case it would be Israel, don't just rubber stamp the sale of this technology. I should say that in Canada, there really is no safeguard against the Canadian export of this type of technology either. So maybe there's no Canadian company selling it right now, but I expect there could be, in which case, at the very least, Canada should be leading in this area, setting very high standards. And as I said before, our own intelligence agencies procure this type of technology from vendors. One thing that we could do is establish something like the US Commerce Department recently did, which is an allow and deny list. So you say, these companies, you're not allowed to do business with here in the United States. They recently put NSO Group and several other hack-for-hire mercenary surveillance firms on this deny list, and it had a big impact on their business, as you might expect. I would hope that other countries would do similar things. And if we do, we begin to claw away at some of the ways in which this market is now simply a Wild West, causing all sorts of harm.
I'm interested, though, that unlike Edward Snowden, who wants a complete ban on this kind of thing, you have said, no, we just need more robust government oversight. Why aren't you prepared to go for the full-out ban like patriot/traitor Snowden is?
Well, I think that it's not practical. That's the main reason for me. And I would debate with someone like Ed that whether it's even desirable or not. This is an extremely powerful technology in the ways that I described. Once you get inside somebody's device, you have access to their entire world. And that needs to be treated with an extreme degree of caution. I would say this is the digital equivalent of nuclear weapons in a way. Now, just as with nuclear weapons, we can wish that they didn't exist. We can't put the science back in the bottle, so to speak. So what do we do then? Well, we have to treat it in a step-by-step manner. And obviously the place to begin is by regulating it properly, which is a good thing because we live in a liberal democracy, which is defined by, among other things, checks and balances around the state. And that's what's absent here right now. And as a consequence, we're seeing enormous harm.
Ron, we're down to our last few minutes here, and I want to ask you about something that the Citizen Lab is working on. You're about to release, I gather, a new report about, quote unquote, digital transnational repression. What does that mean?
Well, in ways, it's exactly what we've been talking about. There are many people who live in autocratic regimes or authoritarian countries and have fled abroad, fled to places like Canada for their safety, trying to make a new home for themselves and their family, safe from the gaze of the tyrants and the despots that they used to be subjected to. But what we're finding is, thanks to this type of technology and other methods, authoritarians are able to reach across borders and continue the type of repression that they used to only be able to do mostly within their borders. So that's the digital transnational repression. Our report was actually motivated by our investigations into a few Canadians who had been hacked by government adversaries from abroad. And what we noticed is that, they were experiencing psychological harm, trauma, if you will. If you think about it, imagine if you learn that your phone was hacked and maybe someone was murdered as a consequence of what the adversaries learned from your private communications. You'd be horrified, you might be traumatized. We also learned that a lot of these people aren't receiving help here in Canada for this type of problem, and they should, we believe. So we did extensive interviews with a number of subjects and asked them questions about their experiences, either being targeted or having their devices hacked in the manners that I just described. And we've come up with a number of recommendations to hopefully improve the situation here in Canada.
Are you able to say which Canadians had their phones hacked in this case?
Well, I can say for the ones that agree to go public, yes. Omar Abdulaziz, who I just mentioned, was a very close confidant of Jamal Khashoggi. The rest of the people, we have to do research under research ethics protocols at the university that guarantees anonymity to the people who are human subjects in the research. I can tell you, though, these are people coming from China, from Tibet, from Rwanda. Horrible transnational repression using NSO's Pegasus by Paul Kagame in Rwanda, often combined with death squads, and people from Syria, Iran. So, this is a global problem that's impacting people that we have welcomed here in Canada, and we have an obligation, we believe, to support.
And just finally, I presume that Canadian authorities know that this kind of thing is happening. Are they intending to do anything about it?
Well, we hope so. That's we make a number of recommendations to guide Canadian authorities to better help these type of people. I mean, one of the problems is we have a domestic intelligence agency, CSIS, in this country, not a law enforcement agency. And they often treat these type of people more as intelligence assets than people they should help, which actually amplifies the problem rather than alleviating it. And then when it comes to law enforcement, almost all of these people that we interviewed said that they tried to phone the police because of the experiences that they encountered, harassment online, et cetera, and the police just shrugged it off in almost every single case. So we need to educate law enforcement about this problem and make sure there are resources to help people who experience this.
Gotcha. Ron, we always appreciate your visits to our program. You are the director of the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto, and you're welcome on our program anytime. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me again.
Coming up after the agenda.
Whenever I go to the grocery store, it seems as if the food is costing more and more. That is, if I can find the thing that I'm looking for.
In the conversations, it's really very middle-class people are not able to buy whatever they want at the grocery store.
We have seen a lot of people in this province have to start walking through the doors of a food bank or a food center for some support.
It's been a very important time for the understanding of the food industry and the food system as a whole.
That's next on TVO.
And that is the agenda for Wednesday, February 23rd, 2022. Tomorrow, Namki Wanuka checks in on the so-called wellness industry and whether it's got something of a race problem. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. And Nam, we'll see you here tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.